All right, welcome to practice 4.1. We're looking at principles of conditioning, and there are several of them. So this lecture we'll look at specificity, overload, and progression. And if you look, I'm outside here on the UW-Manitowoc campus overlooking Lake Michigan. So it's a beautiful day, so I thought I would step outside for today's lessons. All right, just to give an overview what practice 4 will look like. We're going to be looking at these 8 fitness principles, or principles of conditioning. So let's begin by looking at specificity. We've already kind of mentioned a few of these when we look at the SAID principle, specific adaptations to impose demands. So this would be the S in that SAID principle. So if we look at specificity, my image is kind of blocking part of that, but that's specificity. Basically what specificity it is you want to train how you're going to perform. We're going to have the best crossover in those situations. So I have a couple pictures of people doing free throws, right? It's always a good idea to work on the free throw form, but if you're in a quiet gym all by yourself, there's benefit to that, but to really get that specificity in training, you want to develop distractions. You want to maybe create a little pressure. You want to kind of mimic the game-like situation as best as possible. Again, this might be a little bit later in training, not necessarily maybe in the preseason, but that's where we get more into that technique and whatnot. So again, think about the muscle groups, the movement patterns and planes, that speed. If you're going to practice at 70%, there's some benefit to building in technique and skill, but we then ultimately want to practice at 100% at several times. And we want to incorporate the equipment we're going to be using and like I mentioned, the environment we're going to be competing in. So I know many teams will show up maybe the day before or early and have a few practices in the gym they're going to be competing in. So another thing with specificity is to be familiar with muscle movements. I'm not going to go over all these with you here, but just take a moment to review your major muscle groups and their movements. This class isn't as interested in the origin and insertion like anatomy and physiology, but it does help to know the muscle groups, especially for the sport you're planning for. So other things with specificity, right? Does it require agility? Does it require power, reaction time? So think about those those health and skill related components of fitness, and then what types of stimulus, what types of workouts can target those. So again, when we think about designing a workout, I'm just going to move this guy over here. When we think about designing a workout, again, we want to think about the FIT principle, the frequency, intensity, type, and time. We definitely want to have a warm-up, and a warm-up is going to prepare the body for activity, right? That's going to be more of those dynamic, active types of warm-ups. Think about those movement patterns that will be performed on the athletic field or the court. When we think about the planned activity, we generally want to begin with an aerobic type of activity. Usually that's the more demanding, and that's going to really warm up the body. Then we move into weight training. It's more general. And then we move more into the activity specific. So that could be in a particular workout, or that could be over the periodization of a season. We kind of want to follow that typical pattern. And then we want to have a cool down, right? We want to return our muscles back to a cool down state. And that's going to include more of that static stretching and again those muscles we used. So we think about cardiorespiratory endurance in particular. This really involves like the larger muscle groups with a planned repetitive types of movement. Usually cardiorespiratory endurance, it's aerobic in nature, so it's going to be more of that moderate to upper moderate, so we're getting plenty of oxygen to fuel our moving muscles. And again, just kind of review that our blood sugar, our glycogen, muscle sugar, is the primary fuel for activity within that first 20 to 30 minutes of activity. After that, especially if the intensity is low, we begin to burn fat storage. So again, think about those energy systems. So we look at specificity, and then we look at overload. So again, we want that Goldilocks general adaptation syndrome where we have enough stimulus to cause these adaptations. So the overload should stress our systems slightly beyond what they're accustomed to. So typically when we think of muscle stimulus, we want to stress those muscles to, it's called volitional failure or fatigue. So that's when you're lifting a weight and basically your muscle cannot contract anymore without breaking form. That's volitional failure. There's some studies, which maybe we'll look at later this semester, is some studies say the weight really doesn't matter as long as we're lifting to volitional failure. So if that takes 25 reps to do that, or 5 reps, it's still going to cause adaptations. So the specificity would say, are you doing more endurance where you need that muscular endurance, where you want those 25 reps, or are you doing more strength and power where you may need those 5 reps? So, right, the fitness recommendations for overload, if we look at health for the general population in general, we want to accumulate a minimum of 30 minutes a day of moderate intensity activity on most days of the week. So again, we can see the FIT principle applied there. But as athletes, the scientific conditioning athletes, we want to hit that skill development, right? So we need to sustain 30 to 90 minutes of a moderate to vigorous activity 3 to 5 days a week. I'm going to put a little caveat there because we can't really sustain vigorous activity for more than 30 minutes, but we're going to have like those high intensity intervals over that duration. So this is again a review from maybe the previous slides when we looked at exercise prescription, but this is a good point to remind us about what that specificity and overload would look like for strength training. When we look at cardiorespiratory endurance and we look at overload, there's different ways we can do that for overload. Typically, early in the season, we do a long, slow distance where we want to build mileage. We want to accustom the body to be moving over long periods of time. And then we can build in some speed or intervals. So those would be a fartlek. It's kind of a funny word to say, fartlek. But that is Swedish for speed training or speed variance. So that would be picking up the pace. If we're running at maybe a 7-minute mile pace, we'd pick it up to maybe a 6.5 minute mile pace for a shorter period of time. And then ease back. So we can do like tempo runs. So that'd be more like almost kind of race pace in shorter intervals. Right, we do over or under speed training. So under speed training would be doing like running up hills or running with like a parachute or resistance bands. That would be over speed training would be like running down hills or running with bands being pulling you. That threshold training is right around that lactic acid threshold training. So maybe if 80 to 85% of your target heart rate zone is where your lactic acid builds up, we're going to be pushing that threshold. And really don't want to exceed 10% increase each week, because then that can overstress our systems and potentially cause injury or increase recovery time. So for this practice 4.1, we'll finish up with progression. So we want to cause these overload in a progressive manner. And to best illustrate this is the Greek myth of Milo and his bull. So Milo of Croton, he was an excellent wrestler, and he was a rancher. Right? So one day this calf was born out in the field, and Milo went out and picked up the calf and took him into the stable at night. And each morning he would pick up that same calf and take him out into the pasture in the morning and carry that bull calf back to the stable each evening. So as that bull calf grew, and every day Milo would go out and pick up that bull, and gradually Milo's muscles adapted to the weight of the bull. And eventually Milo was able to carry this full-grown bull on his shoulders. Now legend has it that Milo would walk into the wrestling arena with this bull on his shoulders and walk around the wrestling area several times to kind of get the crowd going and to intimidate his opponent. So apparently somebody tried this. I would not recommend that to you, but it does illustrate the point of this progressive overload. There's no way Milo would be able just to go and pick up that full-grown bull one day, but every day picking up that calf as it added weight, he was able to adapt. So again, that's what we think about, that progression, that progressive overload. We want to prepare the body for that through proper warm-up and training. So those are the first 3 fitness principles we'll be looking at, of principles of conditioning.